Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Axelrod. I'm past president of the Rotary Club of Silicon Valley Passport, and I'm your chair for the District 5170 Book Club. And the idea behind the book club is we want to, many people have written books, many people, but I want to be able to support Rotarians and Rotarians' families. And that's what makes our club different from so many of the other book clubs. So I have the pleasure right now of introducing Jacqueline Widmar Stewart. Jackie is a native of Beverly Shores, Indiana. She earned her degree in law from Stanford and in languages from the University of Colorado and Michigan with studies abroad. She has written 8 books, of which 3 were published in Europe. The most recent Hidden Women series books have won independent press awards, numerous awards. Blair is her devoted husband, her sidekick, and what I can just see all around best friend. That's been my experience of watching the 2 of them. He belongs to the Palo Alto University Rotary Club, which meets Friday mornings. The couple now research and produce short films on the heroic role of women in Celtic Europe. Their approach seems to shed lights on Europe's darkened past and why did Jackie's grandparents flee Slovenia. So we're going to be learning a little bit more about it. And here's the book. And Jackie, it's a pleasure to have you as our speaker tonight.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thanks for being here. We really love seeing all of you. It gives me great pleasure to talk about Slovenia, one of my favorite topics. All 4 of my grandparents, as Lisa mentioned, have come from Slovenia to the US before the World Wars. When I go back to Slovenia, I visit the home where my grandmother was born and the villages where my cousins live. And it's so beautiful there in the foothills of the Alps and where our relatives still hunt mushrooms in the forest, just like my mom did. The younger generation, thankfully, continues the tradition of the gostilna, and that is the gathering place of the area. We are finding more and more that the gostilna is the equivalent of the German Gasthof or the French auberge or the English pub. Anyway, when I studied for a year at the University in Ljubljana, I used to sit in my cousin's gostilna and meet people from France, from Germany, and see a relative who flew people back and forth to Switzerland. Ever since my parents and I first went back to the old country and discovered our relatives who'd been cut off by 2 world wars, I have been searching for the answer. Why did they leave? I'm filling in the picture little by little, but it's taking us all the way back to the Iron Age and beyond now, too. With this short film I'm about to show you, I want you to see where we are in that search. Before the clip, I want to mention something that came to my attention, thanks to a Rotary friend. He sent over an article from the Sunday New York Times that recognizes Slovenia as one of the 52 places where travelers can be part of the Earth's environmental solutions. 1 year after Slovenia had declared its independence, the government set up a farm stay network that helped farmers accommodate dining guests and overnight guests too. That, together with a network of trails that crisscross its picturesque landscapes, have showcased Slovenia as a gourmet and hiking haven, which we've always known since we first stepped into Slovenia. Before we start, let me clarify some terms. When we talk about the Common Era, we mean our era, counting from year 0. So we make references to the Common Era and before the Common Era. Why? Because most accounts glorify the attackers. Most accounts are written by the victors, the conquerors. The normal narrative doesn't acknowledge that there was even an advanced Celtic culture before the year zero, as though prehistory did not exist. For us, that's all changed because we see a rich, flourishing world before the advent of Christianity. And the reason that matters so much now is that men and women were co-equals then. Society honored the accomplishments and valor of both its men and women. Women's rights. We see that the pre-Christian world honored women in ways we do not know today. We're watching in real time the erosion of rights that our ancestors prized and fought for. That's why we need to learn from our Celtic European ancestors before the Common Era, before the advent of Christianity. We hope that you will find this new film to be informative, both about Slovenia itself and about the wealth of discoveries Slovenia brings before and after year zero. So here we go. Hello, I'm glad you're here. I want to introduce you to a land that guards the beauty of its idyllic landscapes, from soaring mountain peaks to the salty seawaters of the Adriatic. Slovenia is a wonderful place with welcoming people, and I say that with pride since all four of my grandparents came from there. I also say it as an author whose book Finding Slovenia was published by the Slovenian-Press. My book came out in 2009 and the second edition is in the works. So my remarks today will include new material that I've uncovered for the new edition. Why Slovenia? Why now? Let me explain my involvement. My quest to find the real story of Europe's past stems from the question of why my grandparents left their homeland. In 1967, my parents and I first made our way back to the old country looking for relatives from whom we'd been cut off by 2 world wars. 3 years later, I was back in Slovenia's fabulous capital city of Ljubljana for a year's study at the university. In 1991, Slovenia declared its independence, and shortly after that led the EU. I wanted to honor Slovenia with a book showcasing what a magnificent place it is and its history. I'm so gratified that Slovenia's major bookseller published my book and that it's now in its 7th printing with a new edition soon to be out. Writing Finding Slovenia intensified my search. How could my grandparents leave Slovenia? Since then, I've written 6 more books, each leading deeper into the European past. The upshot is that I've added a whole new foundational layer to the Slovenian story and to the story of all of Europe, and that's the Celtic one. And let's talk about the Celts for a minute because there's a lot of misconception about them. Part of it comes from pronunciation, Celt or Celt. It's all fine. It's pronounced different ways in other languages too. Celts have been, and mostly still are, Europe's resident population. And they're not only in Scotland and Ireland. Archaeological evidence puts them all over Europe, from the British Isles to Anatolia. Slovenia in particular allows views into this family-based, nature-loving culture that honored both men and women heroes for valor and for invention. The treatment of women changed when Rome invaded and occupied Europe. as the Roman Empire, because Rome imposed its laws on Europe, and those laws treated women as property to be owned by others. The later Christianity conquest imposed those same laws that denigrated women. Let's look at some dates to clarify this. I have a timeline here that starts from the present and works backwards. Let me highlight 3 periods here. Beginning in the 6th century, the Duchy of Carantania included all of Eastern Europe, and it was a governing system based on defense. The duchies were composed of counties, and so both dukes and duchesses, counts and countesses, were the government officials responsible for calling up troops when under attack. During the 100 years before the Common Era, Slovenian lands lay partially in the large area of Pannonia that covered much of Eastern Europe. It also extended west into what was called Noricum. Pannonia and Noricum are normally thought to be Roman, but these names preceded the Roman invasion. The Iron Age, that is, during the 1,000 years before the current era began, the Iron Age is key to understanding Slovenia's past because iron smelting technology was developed in the nearby area in Hallstatt, Austria. That resulted in enormous prosperity to all of Europe because that knowledge spread very fast. The Iron Age is also known as the Hallstatt era and is generally thought to have been around 850 to 500 before the Common Era. Now here's a very interesting twist to this story. Before the First World War, a woman began uncovering Iron Age artifacts in Slovenia and in Austria. That challenged the Christian version of history because it showed proof of advanced life there much earlier. The Duchess of Mecklenburg discovered Celtic artifacts in both Slovenia and Austria, 10,000 of them. She found metal wine mixing pails known as situla with scenes from the Iron Age. She also found intricate metal jewelry, beautifully crafted. The only part of her finds in the US are now in Harvard's Peabody Museum. And Harvard Press published an entire book about her discoveries. These finds further show what a primary location Slovenian lands occupy. Slovenia has been a vital part of Europe, both past and present, as an ancient crossroads for trade. Its second largest city, Celje, literally Seltsville, was along the ancient amber route that joined the North Sea with the Adriatic. The refuge castles and walled cities that dot Slovenia give an idea of how much this land was sought after, even though only a fraction of castles still remain. Locals would maintain the castles and hole up in them when under attack. Defenders relied on wine to sustain them if their water source became contaminated. Who were the attackers, and what happened to Celtic residents? We imagine that life under either the Roman Empire or medieval Christian Empire was pretty much the same. Both Roman legions and Christian crusaders slaughtered millions of Celts, and those who survived were subjugated. When the Romans occupied Europe, whether as the Christian or Roman Empire, they imposed laws that took away women's rights. And that happened everywhere in Europe that Rome touched. And remember that the church state imposed heresy laws that heavily impacted women, and that these heresy laws were in effect for some 1,400 years, which means most of the Common Era. From the 13th to the 18th century, untold thousands of women were burned at the stake as witches under heresy laws. For a Celt, Roman or Christian rule meant that your property was seized and you served your authoritarians, your all-male masters. Celtic women who had been co-equal with men in the Iron Age were now treated as inferior to men, as chattel owned by men. Celtic places were often renamed, repurposed, and claimed as Roman, or later as Christian. The medieval church state controlled civil society by installing their nobility. Sometimes, though, not all the Celtic features were completely erased. Sometimes you can still detect Slovenia's Celtic traces. And in this respect, Slovenia serves as a way of seeing such traces all over Europe. Seeing the past through Slovenia can broaden our view of what's happened all over the world. What still sustains Slovenians? What has been a constant from the Iron Age archaeology to the present? Slovenia preserves and revels in its natural splendors, but also openly and inclusively shares them with guests. This we have found is a common Celtic attribute all over Europe, and wine remains a main ingredient as part of that hospitality. One other ancient feature of Celtic culture that still revitalizes Slovenians and forms a common thread of Celtic culture all across Europe is hot springs, the natural sources of heat that enabled ancient settlers to survive the winter, still warm Slovenians in very delightful ways. Right at the main square, the Celts always built a fest hall. Before the Christian conquest, events for the solstice took place in those halls at the same time throughout the Celtic world. Family celebrations, like weddings and commemorative ceremonies, also would have taken place there. Since the Christian conquest, though, the fest hall is no longer in the public domain. The Celtic Fest Hall is now a Christian church, a remnant of the medieval church state. Let's learn from the past so we won't be doomed to repeat it. The truth is that the Celts built Europe, and it's the strong familial fibers of Celtic Europe that still hold it together. Celts were, and are, the architects, the masons, the glazers, the vintners, the weavers. The takeaway is the pre-Christian European society honored valor and invention of both men and women. So we know we have that legacy. The denigration of women causes unnatural and harmful imbalances that sap half our strength as humans and expose us to subjugation. We need to reinstate our Celtic values and keep religion out of governance. Our discoveries are just scratching the surface of a blanked out Celtic European culture. We're so excited about the prospects for a more honest assessment of the ancestral past, especially as it relates to us now. We envision a return to a balanced society where both men and women are prized for their accomplishments, regardless of skin color, nationality, or any other categorization. With justice and liberty for all. Thank you very much.
It's delightful.
Thank you very much.
Wow, that was wonderful. A round of applause. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. The beauty of the country, and it made me feel like I was there. You know, I wanted to taste the food. I wanted to take a walk. So it was a beautiful experience, and I'm seeing nods from people right here. I had some questions that I put in, and there's some comments. And before we go further, I'm going to call him Blair here. He's also going to serve as the co-host. It was wonderful. And Jackie, if you could be sure somewhere along the line to talk about the jewelry, because that jewelry is really exquisite. Blair, would you like to look at some of the questions and see what we can offer Jackie?
Yes, thank you. So let me take the first question here that I see. And it's, what is the most important event in the last 120 years that coalesced into Slovenia's Declaration of Independence?
I love this question because it pulls together our research to date. To answer it, I'd like to give some framework, and that framework is our basic freedoms. And then I want to read about my own personal experience of being in Ljubljana the very day when I saw Slovenian sentiments coalesce into what would become their Declaration of Independence. So the way we conceive of Europe is the residents versus the attackers. And Celts prize their inclusivity, rules that apply to all democratic laws, public lands, speech, gatherings. Gatherings were huge. Divide and conquer, on the other hand, is the forces against that, the subjugation of locals, elites above the law, control by dictators, privatization, imposition of language, killing, and displacements. Now, here's the passage that I'd like to read from my book, Finding Slovenia. I chanced to be in Ljubljana on the day in 1988 that proved to be the breaking point. You could tell at once that the day belonged to history. The otherwise loquacious populace just listened. Every man, woman, and child clutched a transistor or clustered near a radio. At the military court in Ljubljana on that day, 4 writers were on trial for articles they had published in the newspaper Mladina, which means the youth. As I recall, they were accused of publicizing names of those the Yugoslav military intended to eliminate. Yugoslavia, consisting of the republics of Serbia, which had the biggest population and land, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Macedonia, operated under the Serb-dominated military. 2 issues about the trial riled people. The court was military instead of civil, and the proceedings were conducted in the Serbo-Croatian language instead of Slovenian. As the 4 defendants were led away to prison after the trial, some 10,000 silent Slovenians stood near the courthouse and held flowers up to them. The sentencing of the Mladina authors coalesced Slovenians against the government. Slovenia demanded greater autonomy in the Yugoslav government and continued to press even as its demand was rejected. On June 25th, 1991, the Slovenian government declared independence.
Here's another question, Jackie. Slovenia has the biggest unlogged old growth forest in Europe. Where is it? What is it? What can you tell us about that?
The name of the place is kind of hard to pronounce. It's called Snežnik, and the World Heritage Site is now the largest forest reserve in Slovenia. It surrounds the mountain of Snežnik, the highest peak in the Karts Plateau in the northwest part of the Dinaric Mountains in Slovenia. It's a primeval forest, primarily of beech trees, and logging in this area began quite late, so the trees were able to have been preserved there. Logging didn't begin until like the 1850s.
Jackie, I've noticed a lot of people want to travel. Are you a travel agent too and a tour guide? If people want to go with you on a tour.
We love it. I've got to be a researcher. As much as I would love to organize trips, now we organize these very intense itineraries for ourselves and cover swaths of land looking at specific things.
What would you recommend that those of us who wouldn't be traveling with you, how would we get there? What is it, like an Airbnb, bed and breakfast? What would we do?
You know, the sky's the limit. We stay in castles. You can stay in a variety of different things. And this most interesting new network that is in Slovenia now of the farm stays allows you to go into farms and really experience life on the farm and fresh food on the table and the local wines and the local customs. It's a wonderful way of really becoming a guest of the local people and learning local places.
We have a related question here. Maybe this is a good time to have it, which is, how do you get around in Slovenia? What are some tips for the traveler? Do you want to take that on?
Go right ahead. You're on a roll.
You can get around. You can get to Slovenia by air. There's an international airport. No direct flights from the U.S. yet, but through Frankfurt, through London, through Paris, through Amsterdam, it's available. And when you're there, we find the best way to get around is in a car, and we rent a car. The roads are good, the signage is good, the maps are good. It all works well. But you can also get around by train or bus. But the issue there is that it takes longer to coordinate schedules. You don't have the same flexibility and so on. Though the Slovenian language is not something that most of us are familiar with, English is widely spoken, and I wouldn't let the language issue be a big factor or even a factor, because they've been teaching English in the school since 1990 or so.
Right.
And so there are many people everywhere who speak English. And you'll learn some Slovenian words. Dober dan, dober jutro, Slivovic. Now that's a favorite word. The food is good. And there are accommodations from luxury to hotels by the sea to farm stay places, everything. So it's great. It's great.
Leif Erikson was asking about the interaction of the Celts and the Vikings.
I have all kinds of ideas about that. I think they're the same. And I would love somebody to study that. There are indications with just the heroic epics and the designs and the beauty of those ships and the there's a lot that has been obscured and given a completely different explanation. And I would love to see somebody tackle those kinds of questions on a fact-based kind of inquiry rather than relying on what we've been told.
Here's a question, which is, so why did your grandparents leave?
Well, it's religion. We're piecing this together. My cousins have done some work in this area too, and trying to understand more about our grandparents, because both grandfathers were coal miners and eventually ended up in Southern Illinois. And what we hadn't known until very recently, thanks to this cousin, who I might mention is a geologist who studies geology in Slovenia too. So we see that side of Slovenia too, which is wonderful. Through this cousin, we came to learn that my grandparents were working with Mother Jones. And so they were organizing, and they were growing grapes and they were producing wine. And one of the most surprising things we found as a result of his studies and related studies is that before Prohibition, Missouri was producing the most wine of any state in the country, which seems very unlikely. But you start thinking, well, our grandparents were right there near St. Louis. St. Louis was their town. And Missouri was part of the Louisiana territory that was France. So, of course, they were producing wines. But Prohibition made an enormous difference in that, too. But anyway, we went back, we pieced things together, information like that. And we've been back to Essen, which was where my grandmother left Europe. I fled Europe because if you're a woman pregnant with 3 kids, it's not a cruise that you're taking without your husband to help. She fled, and we found out when we were in that area in Essen that shortly after she left, about 70 women were murdered. So it's a puzzle, and we're linguistically we're seeing more and more of the connections. Because people seem to leave those breadcrumbs as they go, and thank heavens they do.
Here's one that I'll take on. A viewer who says she's just back from Slovenia. I hope you had a wonderful time there. And she's asking about one of the famous statuary in Ljubljana, which is the Dragon Bridge, and the dragons there, which are beautiful bronze sculptures on the head of the bridge. And she says, are those Roman relic or Celtic? Well, I think they're Celtic, because in the Celtic tradition, say in Wales, you have the dragon there again. And they're depicted in a similar way.
There's the legend that of Jason and the Golden Fleece, which is a Greek legend that talks about Jason coming from the Black Sea into Ljubljana, and at Ljubljana, where the river turns, the Ljubljanica River makes a curve. He is supposed to have slain the dragon there. So there's that Greek myth that relates directly to those dragons as well. But we're seeing dragons too under the feet of women depicted in murals of very early churches. And so there's that connection. So there's a wealth of research to be done here.
More questions than answers.
More questions than answers is right.
But we did have a question about something Lisa mentioned earlier, that your connection with the Palo Alto Kids Foundation.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that was and what you did there?
Well, in the early 90s, a classmate of mine from Stanford and another woman, there were three of us who got together and wanted to do something for East Palo Alto children, because we had kids in the Palo Alto school district, and realized that without a big injection from the parents, these kids wouldn't have PE or library or art or a lot of different activities that we just took for granted. So we wanted to give money to the East Palo Alto children to help them learn. And we ended up, and the whole way that this was able to work was our fourth founder, who was from East Palo Alto and a very well-respected community member, who gave us the credibility to set up that foundation in East Palo Alto. And it's still, today, it gives money directly for teachers to things they need. There's a short application, 1 page, and funding is twice a year. Projects that benefit the children in that classroom. So we saw it as a conduit that would allow us to directly reach those children. It's all volunteer, and they have continued to do just an amazing job of helping the kids. And they go into the classrooms, and so the kids know there's somebody there who's concerned about their education.
Quick question on that. What is a typical grant size?
It used to be 350, then it went up to 700.
Teachers, so they can have it for the classroom, so it doesn't come from the teachers' pockets.
Exactly right. And mainly it's books and field trips. But
so the application process, I'm assuming, is very straightforward, seamless.
Very straightforward. Yes. And a lot of teachers are on the board too. So usually at grant time, if there was a problem with an application, teacher would get on the phone and say, well, you're asking for this. I know of where there's one. It's over here in this school, and let me get it to you. So there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on too. It's people really working together to enable things. One time we ended up funding a mouse for a computer because the whole computer system was unusable, and all it took was this replacement of a mouse that they couldn't get funding for. Things like that make the whole thing happen. If you go to www.epak.org, it's East Palo Alto Kids Foundation, EPAK. You can get all of the financial information.
There was a question about the Slovenian economy, and let me take that on. And the question was, is it a lot of tourism? Well, there's some tourism, and I count that as visitors from outside the country. There's the hospitality industry is pretty big because there are gastilnas and restaurants and people getting together all the time. These are, not foreign tourists. These are Slovenians enjoying it. But there's also high tech. There's wonderfully crafted wooden articles. There's wine, although I'll say I've seen that most of the wine gets drunk in Slovenia, so there's not too much that's exported, and I can understand that. And Slovenia is a fairly small country. It's less than 2.5 million or about that. Well, what are some of the places in Slovenia that you like, and what do we like to do? Let's talk about that, because kind of bringing it back to what a visitor might be interested in?
Well, there's an expression that the Slovenians say. They say, if you aren't climbing Triglav, you're not Slovenian. This is the highest mountain that's in the northwest alpine corner of Slovenia, Triglav National Park. They have rangers who will help you put together itineraries and help you arrange your trips, because these mountains are nothing to fool with, as I personally can attest. We went on a hike with Austrian friends of ours when the kids were little, and they came all prepared with their hiking boots and their walking sticks, and we had on tennis shoes. And by the end, we were almost crawling back to the car. But I want to tell you about this one most amazing experience. We'd walked and walked and walked. The guys would run ahead and take dips in the pools that they knew about and so on. And so we came to this one area after the lakes where there were just solid walls on either side, just soaring cliffs. And as we started to approach that, you started to hear sounds starting really high and then just surrounding you, because they were starting to yodel. And these people were, I mean, the sound was just bouncing all around, ricocheting all around you. It was fantastic to be in that kind of echo chamber with all the yodelers. And then we continued on and walked and came to a meadow where you could see there was a hut on the other hill, and our Austrian friends knew that it was coming up. And so as we approached, we started hearing sounds again, people hanging off the edge of the deck on this gorgeous day were singing in 4-part harmony all these alpine songs. It was just unbelievable. So it was getting cold by then. We're going up into the mountains further and further. And they had the typical blackboard that tells you the menu of things they had to serve there. And so the soup was one of them. That sounded pretty good because it was getting chilly. And so I imagined an enormous can of Campbell's soup and a big can opener. And so I was shocked and amazed when we walked into the building and the kitchen door just flew open a little bit. And here is a woman in there cutting the noodles. She is making the soup from scratch. And turns out they have a heliopad just in back where they get all of the supplies delivered. And so they had wonderful fresh soup and wine and beer and whatever. The Slovenians take their food very seriously. I know that from my own family. It's great.
So
other places, waters, lakes, those gorgeous alpine lakes in Bled and Bohinj, which are in that northwest corner of Slovenia, thermal baths where you go in and you lie on bubbles of jets, all kinds of jets for your shoulders, whatever you need. They have jets they have channels where you can actually feel as though you're swimming down the river or try to swim against it. Indoor, outdoor pools, you can swim out under the stars. It's amazing. And you have places where you can stay in a hotel and never go outside. It either connects underneath or across, walkways to lead you right to the thermals. And the thermals are just magnificent. You have housing nearby that offers a range of different possibilities, little cottages or in the hotel where you get everything provided. Rivers, they love their rivers. Ljubljana itself has wonderful river walks. There's an island in the Kirka River called Otochets, which has a castle in the middle of the river where you can stay or even just drop in and have a snack in the afternoon. The whole area around it is park. It's gorgeous.
You said snack in the afternoon. So that
Mhm.
brings me to one of my topics I wanted to be sure we covered, which is the desserts of Slovenia. And go ahead.
Well, there's potica, which is the walnut holiday bread. There's gibanica, which is from a town closer to the Hungarian border. So it has poppy seeds in it as well as.
It's dynamite. It's dynamite. Gibanica. Think of a cream tiramisu kind of thing that has poppy seed layer.
And apples. Palachinka are the crepes. You can have them with all kinds of different fillings. The kremschnitt, in fact, we have a very esteemed listener who makes a fabulous kremschnitt. And ice cream. In Ljubljana, you can get this sour apple ice cream that is unbelievable. It doesn't, you'd never order it if you hadn't heard that it is wonderful. It is unbelievable. There's also a sour cherry that is fantastic. And you have to try them from different vendors to see which is the best. That's a great pastime. Everybody loves that. The marketplace in Ljubljana.
That's what I wanted to say.
Along the river, and it's where everybody goes. And it's funny because even as we're traveling to these very remote places now all over Europe, and going to the marketplace on Saturday is where you'll find everybody. It's still such a gathering place, and they bring in the produce from the countryside and the crafts and
the mushrooms
and the cheeses, and it's just fantastic. The Ljubljana market is wonderful. It follows the river, and the architecture there is so beautiful too because of this early 1900s complete redevelopment by Plečnik, who also worked in Prague. So you see a lot of the similarity in architecture between some things in Prague and in Ljubljana especially.
I'm very disappointed that we're all not eating dessert. Is there a local restaurant on the peninsula that people should try?
That's harder to find a Slovenian restaurant here. But go there. The food is so good because generally all sourced very locally, and it's generally cooked for you. It's not something that's frozen and comes in on a truck. So when you're by the sea, the seafood is fantastic. There are roasts, there's vegetables, there are wonderful salads, soups. Every meal usually starts with a bowl of clear soup. It's great. It's great. And if you want, you can top it off with some slivovitz, which is plum brandy, or sometimes made with blueberries or walnut skins or different things. It's good.
May I just show you a couple of photographs from this book? The Duchess of Mecklenburg, A Noble Pursuit. This is from Harvard Press. Isn't that a wonderful little animal?
If you were to want to go to a place in Slovenia, a museum where you could see some of these things, what would you say?
Ljubljana and Bled and Novo Mesto. Those are the three places that have wonderful Celtic collections. Batui, which is way out in the east, always known as the first Roman settlement, but of course it was Celtic before it was Roman. They used to have an amazing exhibit, I hope it goes back up, that showed glass beads that were used as currency all over Europe. They found these things all over, made in Batui in the Iron Age. And in the Ljubljana Museum, there's a lot of glass from very early, first century. You don't think of glass as being available until much later, but glass was very extensively used. In one of the museums, we saw that if glass weren't breakable, it would have been more valuable than gold.
I've got a question about what seasons are best to visit Slovenia. And
Ooh,
that's, I mean,
any
I
of
would,
them.
any of them are. And the winter, if you're a skier, Slovenia has fantastic ski areas,
And skating and
winter
yeah.
sports, and the schools, as the kids are coming up in schools, they'll take a week off in the winter and teach them to ski.
When I studied at the university in Ljubljana, my roommate used to talk about how when she grew up in Maribor, there would be a bus on the weekends that would take the kids up to the slopes, and the older kids would just take care of the little kids. I mean, it was everybody would gather on these buses and then, to spend the day on the slopes and come back. I mean, that was just a regular part of their activity. They had required skiing in the winter and required swimming in the summer as part of the school program, as part of the curriculum.
So there's one question here I want to make sure that you answer. So this is Finding Slovenia. This is in its 7th or 8th printing now, but there's a new one, a revised 2nd edition coming out. And the question, this is one of the newer covers. So this is probably the 7th or 8th printing. They put a new cover on. The question is, when is the 2nd edition going to come out?
We don't know. I'm completely, dependent on my editor. I have my submission, although when we went back to Slovenia, I would add another chapter just based on that trip.
Jackie and Blair, and of course, for all of the viewers here, I'm so glad you're with us. I feel like it was a breath of fresh air that we had an opportunity to travel together and learn at the same time. I still miss that we didn't get that dessert, Blair, but that's okay. That's okay. I know where you live.
Well, we'd like to thank everybody for being here tonight. We see family and friends to be all over this screen, and it's just wonderful.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.